Section 4. The End of Reconstruction. Most whites in the South bitterly resented the Southern Reconstruction governments. They hated the fact that these governments had been forced on them by Yankees. Many taxpayers also blamed their soaring tax bills on corruption, the misuse of public office for personal gain by the South's new leaders. Although some Southern office holders did line their pockets with public funds, most, whether black or white, were honest, capable leaders. Still, when taxes increased, opposition to the new state governments increased as well. However, what bothered many Southerners most about the Reconstructive governments was seeing former slaves voting and holding public office. Across the South, Democrats vowed to regain power and return their states to white man's rule, violence against African Americans. At first, Democrats tried to win black voters away from the Republican Party. When that tactic failed, they attempted to use legal means to keep blacks from voting or taking office. In Georgia, for example, the legislature refused to seat elected black lawmakers until they were forced by the state Supreme Court. When legal methods failed, whites turned to violence. Throughout the South, whites formed secret societies, the most infamous being the Ku Klux Klan, to drive African Americans out of political life. Dressed in long, hooded robes and armed with guns and swords, Klansmen did their work at night, and they started by threatening black voters and office holders, and African Americans who did not heed their threats were beaten, tarred, and feathered, and even murdered. The Enforcement Acts. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed 3 laws to combat violence against African Americans. Known as the Enforcement Acts, these laws made it illegal to prevent another person from voting by bribery, force, or scare tactics. President Grant sent troops into the South to enforce these acts, and hundreds of people were arrested for violence against blacks. Those who were brought on trial, however, were seldom convicted because few witnesses and jurors wanted to risk the Klan's revenge by speaking out against one of its neighbors. The Amnesty Act of 1872. By this time, most Northerners were losing interest in Reconstruction and the plight of the freedmen. It was time, many people said, to let the South alone. One indication of this changing attitude was the passage of the Amnesty Act of 1872. Amnesty means forgiveness for past offenses. The Amnesty Act followed most former Confederates to vote once again. The effects of the Amnesty Acts were seen almost immediately, and by 1876, Democrats had regained control of all but 3 states in the South. Republicans clung to power in South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida, but only with the help of federal troops. The disputed election of 1876. In 1876, Americans went to the polls to choose a new president. Democrats nominated New York Governor Samuel J. Tilden as their candidate, and Rutherford B. Hayes won the Republican nominee. When the votes were counted, Tilden won a majority of the popular votes and 184 electoral votes, just one short of the 185 needed for election. Hayes received 165 electoral votes. 20 electoral votes from 4 states were in dispute. Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, appointed a commission to decide which candidate should get the disputed electoral votes. The commission awarded all 20 to Hayes, giving him exactly the 185 electoral votes he needed to win. Democrats threatened to block the commission's decision. Inauguration Day grew near with no new president in sight. The Compromise of 1877. After weeks of negotiation, Democratic and Republican leaders in Congress agreed to a compromise. The Democrats accepted the Electoral Commission's decision, allowing Hayes to become president. In return, Hayes agreed to withdraw the remaining federal troops still occupying southern states. Once President Hayes withdrew all remaining federal troops from the South in 1877, Reconstruction was officially over. After that, Democrats quickly took control of the last southern states. This is a white man's country, boasted South Carolina Senator Ben Tillman, and white men must govern it. Most white Southerners celebrated the end of Reconstruction, but for freedmen, the return of the South to white man's rule was a giant step backward. The whole South, every state in the South, observed a Louisiana freedman, has got into the hands of the very men that held us as slaves. Section 5, Reconstruction Reversed. With Reconstruction over, the Southern leaders talking of building a new South humming with mills, factories, and cities. Birmingham, Alabama became a major iron-making center, and the number of textile mills in the South grew rapidly between 1880 and 1900. Still, most Southerners, black and white, remained trapped in an old South of poverty, losing ground in education. During Reconstruction, freedmen had pinned their hopes for a better life on education provided by the South's first public schools. When Southern Democrats regained control of states, however, they cut spending on education. Free schools are not a necessity, explained the governor of Virginia. Schools, he said, are a luxury to be paid for like any other luxury by the people who wish their benefits. As public funding dried up, many schools closed, and those that stayed open often charged fees. By the 1880s, only half of the all black children in the South were attending school. Losing voting rights. Southern Democrats also reversed political gains made by freedmen after the war. Many Southern states passed laws requiring citizens who wanted to vote to pay a poll tax. The tax was set high enough that voting, like education, became a luxury that many Southern blacks could not afford. Some Southern states also required citizens to pass a literacy test to show that they could read before allowing them to vote. These tests were designed so that any African American, regardless of his education, would fail. In theory, these laws applied equally to blacks and whites, and for that reason did not violate the 15th Amendment. In practice, however, whites were excused from paying poll taxes or taking literacy tests by a so-called grandfather clause in the laws. This clause said the taxes and tests did not apply to any man whose father or grandfather could vote on January 1, 1867. Because no blacks could vote on that date, the grandfather clause applied only to whites. African Americans protested that these laws denied them their constitutional rights to vote. The Supreme Court, however, found out that the new voting laws did not violate the 15th Amendment because they did not deny anyone the right to vote on the basis of race. Drawing a color line. During Reconstruction, most Southern states had outlawed segregation in public places. When Democrats returned to power, they reversed these laws and drew a color line between blacks and whites in public life. Whites called the new segregation acts Jim Crow laws after a black character, Jim Crow, in an entertainer's act in the mid-1800s. Not all white Southerners supported segregation. When a Jim Crow law was proposed in the South, a Charleston News and Courier editorial tried to show how unjust it was by taking segregation to ridiculous extremes. If there must be Jim Crow cars on railways, there should be Jim Crow's cars on street railways. Also, all passenger boats, there should be Jim Crow waiting salons, waiting rooms. At all stations and Jim Crow eating houses, there should be Jim Crow sections of the jury box, and a separate Jim Crow witness stand in every court, and a Jim Crow Bible for colored witnesses to kiss. Instead of being a joke as intended, most of these ridiculous suggestions soon became laws. Plessy versus Ferguson. African Americans argued that segregation laws violated the 14th Amendment's guarantee of equal protection of laws. Homer Plessy, who was arrested for refusing to obey a Jim Crow law, took his protest all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided his case, Plessy versus Ferguson, in 1896. The majority of the Southern court justices found that segregation laws did not violate the 14th Amendment as long as these facilities available to both races were roughly equal. Justice John Marshall Harlan, a former slaveholder, disagreed. In his dissenting opinion, he wrote, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." After the Supreme Court's decision in Plessy, states passed additional Jim Crow laws. Blacks and whites attended separate schools, played in separate parks, and sat in separate sections and theaters. Despite the court's decision that these separate facilities must be equal, those set aside for African Americans were almost always inferior to facilities labeled as whites only.